Community of Latin American and Caribbean States and the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter, respectively. Mr. President, it's been more than 30 years now that we have been meeting in this General Assembly in order to almost unanimously require the complete, immediate and unconditional lifting of the economic, commercial and financial embargo which in a criminal way has been for more than 60 years applied against the Republic of Cuba and which affects all aspects of life for the Cuban people. The international community recognizes the illegality of this embargo, which is in flagrant violation of all norms of international law and the United Nations Charter. An embargo which concentrates on a system of unilateral coercive measures that are unjust, severe and prolonged, the worst that has been applied to any country in modern history. This is a calculated collective punishment against more than 11 million Cuban men and women that have decided to not bend the knee in the face of the blackmail and coercion of the US regime. It's a planned crime as part of the maximum pressure policy that has its roots in the supremacist mentality of the Monroe Doctrine and that continues to be applied throughout the American continent today. Today, this embargo that has intensified after the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Law is the main obstacle for the development of this sisterly Latin American and Caribbean nation. To put this in perspective, in the last year alone, the embargo caused harm and damage for an amount of more than $5 billion. Moreover, the embargo against Cuba constitutes a massive violation of the human rights of its people. No Cuban family escapes its impacts. This was particularly clear in recent days when the power grid of this sisterly nation was seriously damaged, leaving entire families without electricity for days. This is a direct consequence of the embargo that was celebrated on social media by US representatives, recognizing their responsibility for a clearly criminal policy. Mr. President, the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba on a unilateral list of the government of the United States, branding it as a state sponsor of terrorism, deserves special mention. This is a grotesque work of imperial propaganda which, without having any foundation in reality, manipulates such a sensitive issue only in order to increase the level of aggression against the Cuban nation. Everybody knows that Cuba does not have any connection at all to sponsoring terrorism, but the whole world is threatened in order to obey the orders of the government of the United States. Otherwise, they risk economic coercion in their own country. The genuine promoter and financier of terrorism is the US regime. We demand that it stop these double standards and remove Cuba from a spurious list that it should never have been included upon in the first place. This is an anachronistic policy which, due to its extraterritorial nature, affects all countries or entities that have legal and sovereign economic, trade and financial relations with the brotherly Republic of Cuba. The time has come to correct this historic injustice and put an end to these imperial delusions which impose their national laws on the entire international community. Despite this reality, the US regime will never achieve its goals to convert Cuba into a colony, because the Cuban people are resolved to exercise their right to self-determination, independence and national sovereignty. Mr. President, we support the draft resolution against the embargo on Cuba, and we conclude by calling for a massive vote in its favor. A vote for concrete action to lift the embargo, a vote in favor of the independence of Cuba, a vote in favor of international law and multilateralism, and finally, a vote in favor of an end to be put to neo-colonial projects of domination which make use of embargoes and unilateral sanctions that have no place in the 21st century. We support the entire Cuban people in their demand. Thank you very much, Mr. President.